Hello, I am Xander Balwit. I'm the editor-in-chief of Asimov Press, and today I'm going to be speaking with Calum, who is the author on our latest piece, What We Find in the Sewers. I'll be diving in a little deeper to some of its themes and asking some questions that arose while reading and editing. But before we begin, I would love for Calum to introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. I am Calum Drysdale. I am a PhD student in London studying chemical engineering and building low cost biology automation equipment. And I moonlight as a podcaster myself as the co host of the Anglo-Futurism podcast.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, your piece is on sewage treatment, which is something that I'm incredibly excited by. And I've been interested in sewage since going to a treatment facility with my dad in the early 20 teens. And then since then, I have had many occasions to go to things like ship museums or artistic works like the cloaca in the Modern Art Museum in Tasmania that is like this digestive system that lays a shit at the end with a convincing smell. And so I have been obsessed with all things sewage for a while. But I'm curious when you found yourself interested in this field.
It was back during my undergraduate days, and I'm a biochemist originally by training, and I was working on algae and optimizing algae for kind of biotechnological purposes. And the big problem in algae is that you you need to basically feed them enough so that they can grow quickly, and but feed is expensive, and the products that they produce are not often that valuable or that high concentration, so it costs a whole lot to extract them. And I became absolutely fixated on this idea of using sewage and shit, the organic material from um, human waste, human remains. I mean, it depends how euphemistic we want to be about this. It is shit, which is very rich in like phosphorus and nitrogen, which is exactly what algae need. And I think potentially my excitement there should have been a warning, because since then I've sort of remained interested and excited by the sort of the built environment. I'm like lover of beautiful buildings and big pipes. But it's astonished by the kind of the infrastructure that is required to keep. I mean, I live in London. Keep this like vast amount of sewage not just piling up in the streets. And I suppose I'm now my PhD originally. I mean, I've moved slightly away from it, but it was originally going to be quite shit focused. It was on anaerobic digestion, which is a form of waste of sewage treatment. So I had to sort of explain to friends and family that I was going off to do a PhD in shit polishing. Um,
I'm sure many people feel like that by the end, but in this.
yeah. That's probably true. My problem was I wasn't doing the shit polishing in the last sort of 4 months of writing up. I was doing it. I was planning on doing it for 4 years. The whole way through was just going to be me in waders and a clothes peg on my nose.
Well, there's obviously a lot here. So I like that your experience kind of spans this modern biochemical work, which has taken us a long time to arrive to, and yet humans have been shitting and dealing with waste since the very beginning. And so just to kind of backtrack and give an overview for people that haven't read the piece yet. So your piece for Asimov Press traces humanity's relationship with our waste and effluent through various eras, kind of starting when it was more harmonious. We had excess shit, but people were living in smaller bands and they would just throw it on the field, to cities growing and burgeoning and waste and disease becoming a real problem, which kind of brings us to this period of management and treatment. And then, as usual, we're maybe too thorough or too good with this, and we end up stripping a lot of vital compounds and having this relationship where we kind of want sewage out of sight and out of mind. And now we've kind of circled back to thinking about sewage and waste in a more kind of productive manner that involves some circular economy aspects and epidemiology and finding it a vital resource once again. So I was curious, throughout these various chapters, is there one of these that was the most fascinating to you when you were looking at the various eras of human waste, and something that particularly kind of lit you up.
I think the thing that, and I think we'll talk about it more going forward, but the thing that really, really excited me was the period of the sort of early to mid 19th century. And that is, before Bazalgette is building these sewers, it's this vast period of intellectual fervor and excitement, and particularly centered on London, right? London is the capital of the world, and London is the world city, and it is growing at just an absolutely astonishing pace. So you add something like, I think you add 1 million people in something like 20 years, and that it is a very, very, very rapid growth. And the city that had been, up to now existing, I mean, it wasn't a city. Like, you have the ancient city of London, which no one actually knows exactly when it was founded. Like, its ancient rites are like shrouded in genuine myth because we don't know when it was founded. And you have this like growing conurbation around it, and it's breaking down. It's the systems that had worked for like hundreds of years, like the parish and vestry systems, are breaking down. You've got real intellectual like foment in the form of like the radicals in Parliament who think that all these like old traditions and these old ways of running a country are like outdated and should be swept away. And sewage becomes this real like flashpoint for a lot of them, because I mean, there's a line in the research that a Hackney sort of sanitation or health worker called it like the war of the community on the individual. It's this battle where, as the city becomes denser, all the like ancient freedoms of the freeborn Englishman start being challenged, because actually you're all of a sudden going to have to start building more complicated systems to manage complicated collective problems. And I think it's a fascinating, like, there are many fascinating parallels between that point and the way that people were talking about these issues that have a lot of parallels to our current modern age. And it's, yeah, I mean, I think in my original draft, I filled out something like 9 or 10 pages of like deep bureaucratic like writings about the sort of the various commissions that had been responsible for like arguing over how these sewers were going to work, which I understand why it had to be
Someone's got to crawl through them.
Yeah. But interesting maybe only to me.
I love what you were saying earlier about the built environment too, and London as the kind of the center of this as well. It's funny because when I got the original draft, I was like, of course, I chose a London dwelling writer for this, and now it's all London centric. But really, I can't think of a better city for this exploration of waste and managing, kind of this new period of having to centralize and deal with a ton of people. I mean, ancient Rome might have been a good option as well, but in lieu of finding an ancient Roman writer to write for us, I think this is the next best thing.
Well, I mean, I think that the key thing about London, and the reason that it is so significant, right, is it is the first major city in history that is not a demographic sink. So every other city in history before London, in the 1860s, more people are dying in the cities than are being born. It's like it requires constant replenishment from the rural areas, and it is this period that makes like modern city living in its, like, the way that we currently live. I mean, what the numbers are, something like 70% of people are either now live in cities or are projected to live in cities. But it just wouldn't have been possible without these innovations. And like it marks like such a major turning point in how humans live. And I think it's difficult for us to even comprehend what life at this point was like. I mean, I think probably the best thing that listeners could do is look up the New York horse manure crisis, which I didn't feature, but it is like a fascinating example of New York, pre-automobile, has hundreds of thousands of horses passing through. I mean, sorry, that is not a number that I can guarantee. I can back up. I will. That is possibly hyperbole. The point is there are a lot of horses, and the manure just piles up, and because it's recent enough, you can still find pictures of this. And I encourage listeners to go and do it because it's difficult to just comprehend how much mass, how much volume. This is, you run your numbers yourself, right? Like, city of 5 million, humans produce roughly a pound of shit a day. I mean,
good for you. Yeah.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So some of us produce even more.
Page brag.
Yeah, exactly. But it's just an astronomical quantity, and yet human, the modern Western human sees, maybe their own briefly, the modern German or Dutchman potentially even more so because it sits on a little shelf.
Slab, yeah, it's
exactly. So they can sort of, wow, great, admire their leavings, but we don't see it, right? We don't see it, and that is the product of a number of people who were incredibly impressive and did things that were previously like never thought to be possible, and they created the modern world.
So I want to dig back into this notion of all of the animals and their leaving and kind of being in this super dense, waste filled kind of way of living. And this brings us to a group of people that I found very interesting. And this is earlier than I think the period that you were describing as being particularly exciting to you, but maybe somewhat related in the saltpeter men. I would love I think people have maybe heard of them a little bit, but if you could dilate on who they were and kind of why they were so contentious, that would be great.
Yes, so the saltpeter men, and this is again the past is a foreign country. It's such a foreign idea to us, but the saltpeter men were men who were employed by the crown to source saltpeter, and saltpeter is one of the 3 critical ingredients in gunpowder. The others being it's potassium nitrate, and it's the sort of accelerant that causes the powder to rapidly oxidize and rapidly burn. And it was, there were very in Europe there were very few sources of it. So as you go through the sort of Tudor period, so this is the sort of early modern kind of 16th century, and you get the rise of gunpowder, the countries start realizing that if they're going to, it's a matter of national security, they need to secure reliable sources of gunpowder. And particularly saltpeter. The other ingredients, sulfur and charcoal, are sort of easier to acquire. But so saltpeter is your real limiting factor. And so the method that was come up with was, where can you get this potassium nitrate? So these are where are the sources of nitrates? And the answer is decaying organic matter. And there's a very, very good book called Saltpeter, the Mother of Gunpowder, which talks about the history of saltpeter that I got a lot of this stuff from. And there's a very interesting history about the industrial espionage national espionage, where the recipe of how to produce this is smuggled across Europe, because obviously it's a real state secret. But critically, it involves piling up a whole load of organic matter on a trough in a raised bed, covering it with straw, and crystals start to form on the straw, and you scrape these off, and that's your saltpeter. But obviously this requires you to source a huge amount of nitrates, of organic matter. So the saltpeter men's job was to go around the country, and anywhere that they could find midden heaps, dung heaps, dovecotes, because birds' feces are very, very concentrated. anywhere they could find it, they would dig it up, and they had the right. This it was a French system. It was, and I hope you'll excuse my pronunciation. My early modern
I
French
always do.
pronunciation is not great, but the droit de fouiller, which basically means like the right to dig. So they were allowed to basically go around the country. They could dig anywhere they liked. The local landowners had to provide them with carts in order to transport it. And there are horror stories. They would go and they would dig up church floors because it had been a stable, or there was a woman who was giving birth, and a peterman turns up and like digs up the floor of the house that she's trying to give birth in, and
Yeah, I'm picturing it like the Gestapo. They're coming in there and they're pouring out all of the
I mean,
drawers,
literally,
disrupting life. Yeah.
insane, right? And you, the idea that these people could just turn up, and obviously they were more hated than the taxmen in many ways, many places. So if the saltpeterman was in town, potentially they'd be killed, or they'd be paid off to avoid them digging on your land.
I am curious if people were sitting on such a such a valuable resource. There were no incentives for them to kind of harvest it or process it themselves and bring it to some central repository. Was that something that was done, or was this process of having to dredge it up and then do the whole straw thing, was that too onerous for folks? Like, were there anybody that voluntarily offered up their waste?
I think not that I came across. I think the problem was that actually we are in a period, this early modern period, where commerce is still like developing, and these were desperate days. Like the survival of the nation is at stake here, and I think, and I'm speculating here, but I imagine that paying paying for these paying for this would have made the whole process like uneconomical. So this is why there was such a desperate need that they were using these medieval powers, because they are still medieval, right? This is
Right.
we're right at the cusp of the medieval and modern and early modern period, and you're seeing a transition. The interesting thing is this all ends with imports from India. So when India opens up and trade with India becomes possible, all of a sudden this like disappears, and yes, we move into like a system of global trade. So yeah, I mean you're kind of right. It did happen, but it just was happening in India.
So it's some combination of it being pre-side hustle, so no one was doing this, and then also also medieval England and Europe not being able to actually pay for that. They just needed
Yeah. Exactly.
Interesting. Going back to how loathed they were, I thought this was very interesting. I made you put it in a footnote because of length, but you said because of how detested they were, the system of saltpeter extraction came at a significant social cost, which would plague the successors of Queen Elizabeth, contribute to the Civil War, and even the Royalist loss. And I would love for you to go into those examples a little bit more, because I'm unfamiliar with these historical events and the significance of saltpeter men as driving these forward.
Yeah. So Elizabeth dies in 1603, and then you get a change in dynasty. So you move from the Tudors to the Stuarts, and you have James, and James is is far more high-handed, and then James and then Charles, James the First and then Charles the First, and they carry on this system because they're engaged in wars against the French, and the continued necessity of national defense. The Spanish Armada had happened, within 40 years. It was British naval gunnery that had won the day. So gunpowder is recognised as like critical part of British and I suppose English. No, we are now British actually. With because you have James is also the King of Scotland, and but critically, this process is still ongoing. You still have men going out, scouring the countryside, antagonising people. And it obviously builds hostility to the crown. So when you start, when the Civil War starts getting going, it is one of the reasons that people turn to the parliamentarian cause And it's one of the great like points of anger that the parliamentarians use to bring people to their side, as one of these examples of like the high-handedness of the crown. And at the beginning they promise that they will stop this. It's one of the big promises they make to areas that come to their side. I mean, they're actually unable to keep this up, and they actually have to start using a similar method. But at the beginning it's one of these like, revolutionary promises, right? Free biscuits for everyone, no more saltpeter men. And the other reason that it was so challenging to the king was that a lot of the saltpeter production was done in or around London, and London goes parliamentarian, so the king has to retreat to Oxford, and at the beginning of the war has no access to saltpeter, so his gunpowder is massively gunpowder access is reduced. So he puts out a call to the illegal saltpeter and gunpowder manufacturers who had been working in the kind of forests around Bristol, and they come and rally to the crown. But obviously it takes them a while to set up. So for the first sort of year or so, the king is less well supplied with gunpowder. So it forms part of this like challenge for the crown, is like when these parts of national infrastructures and it's the case of every civil war, right? If you can take the armories and the factories, you're in a lot better position for the war that goes on.
Fascinating. So this resource is absolutely vital, and yet people are distressed about it because of its impingement on their on their privacy and on their individual, on their homes and communities and things like that. Which kind of brings me to, I'm skipping forward a little bit, but it makes me think of some parallels maybe between some modern objections maybe to some of the wastewater tracking, especially when it comes to drugs, and people starting to get a little bit worried about some of the way that we are going to be using some of that tracing of illegal drugs, or of elements of vaccines that are only found in like immigrant populations or things like that. So it kind of feels like we're maybe revisiting some of that same sentiment, and people starting to feel like they have this need to safeguard some of their waste and effluent, or at least things that are therein.
Yeah, it is, as I said, the war of the community against the individual, and the extent to which the state is able and willing to compel action to maintain its own survival, and its ability to do that is largely based on its legitimacy, right?
Yeah.
The COVID vaccine and and monitoring have been massively destructive of the ability of central governments to compel action. And I think the scientific establishment bears a lot of the blame, right? Because I think they have allowed themselves to become politicized in a lot of ways. And so, they have become seen in the same way as the saltpeter men, as arms and tools of the state and state oppression.
Yeah. So before we move into the wastewater-based epidemiology, which I find really interesting, I'd like to close out this period, because you mentioned the parliamentary system, and there's some other figures that I knew played a large role in your piece, including Edwin Chadwick, whose treatment I also had to shorten quite a bit in the interest of length. But he was a fascinating figure. Can you go into a little bit more detail about who he was and what role he played in some of this early development of public health and public health infrastructure?
Yes, so Edwin Chadwick is a very interesting character. He's a man very much of his time, but I think we would also recognize. I think many people now would recognize him, and I think as well. I suspect a lot of your listeners will sympathise with him. I find myself slightly more ambivalent, but he is one of the really early and really significant sanitation reformers. So, he's an acolyte of Jeremy Bentham's, the sort of the inventor or creator of originator, I should probably say, of utilitarianism. And utilitarianism, spreads this idea that by maximizing utility, we can make people as happy as possible, and we can have a utopian or a far better system by just applying principles of government rationally. And this is leapt on by I think people that we would now call sort of policy wonks, or I mean, here in Britain, we seem to be underwater with the number of like 29-year-old men called James who work in the Treasury and who are all really excited to talk about like obscure Treasury rules that prevent building. There is a type here. They probably nowadays they probably are really excited about like walkable cities and public transit. Um,
And nowadays they probably don't have such tremendous beards as Chadwick himself.
well, exactly.
Yeah.
Chadwick is sports a phenomenal beard, an even more phenomenal comb over, and potentially actually maybe more relevant, like a significant private income, right? Because when Bentham dies, he provides Chadwick with a private fortune in his inheritance that allows him to become this great sanitation reformer. Which, well, to the Jameses of the world's credit, they often lack, and yet it doesn't stop them. Um,
So one of the things that he was really bullish on, which is one of the reasons he seems to be kind of the target of so much critique, is this very anti-local government and governance stance. Is that right? So he was one of the primary voices at the time pushing for centralization. Is this right?
yeah, so Chadwick, as I said, is springs from the utilitarian wellspring, and for him, he saw the traditions and the ways of running the country as medieval. But I think it's important to say he's not railing against a genuinely medieval set of behaviors that or laws. He's engaged in kind of the he's angry at the systems that have sprung up over the last kind of 50, 60, 70 years as London is growing. And he's not alone. He's part of a trend of people who see that Britain is now growing, it's now developing, the city is growing larger, and so correct governance requires the country to move from the system where it had previously been of a parish-based or vestry-based system where local worthies, kind of, what was called, kind of dismissively called the squirearchy, will, they come together and they will, pay for local welfare for the poor and the sick, and the what were called cholera orphans and cholera widows. When the man of the house, the breadwinner, died. You see it, for example, in George Eliot's Middlemarch, when there is word that cholera has arrived in the county, and a board of health is formed. And this is not a centrally done thing. This is local landowners came together, and at that point there was no cure for cholera. So what they did was they organised where the emergency cemetery would be. But that was all done locally, and there's a great line in Stephen Halliday's book, The Great Stink, where he talks about how one single road had over 10 boards and commissions responsible for its paving. That there was this vast accretion of like boards and groups and commissions, all of whom were doing small things, and it just built up over years and years and years. And Chadwick wanted to get rid of this. He hated the sort of ruddy-faced localism. He wanted sophisticated, modern, technocratic governance, which would have experts elected and would see them running things in a rational and modern way. He is a very, very modern figure. The great irony, though, is just how many of the things that he thought were right, some of them he got very right, and some of them he got very wrong. And that I think is the sort of like very interesting ambivalence that I feel towards him is because he is so modern, and yet looking back, we now think of him so old-fashioned that he's a great warning to any would-be radical these days, I think.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, some of his complaints about inefficiencies seem like they're very, prescient. Yeah, he also had a very, pathetic, peripatetic kind of intellect. And I was looking at all of the different systems and things that he investigated. And you mentioned like he hated like the ruddy-faced localism. And one of them was drunkenness, for example. Like he had all of these things that he investigated, and some were related to kind of infrastructure, and other things were related to, I don't know, what happens, I guess, in modern cities when you have new people behaving en masse in a certain way, including things like drunkenness.
Yeah, I mean, the reason he first came to prominence was he opposed the poor law. So the poor law was a system that had built up in Britain, and it was a sort of I would say fairly generous system where local magistrates, originally in the sort of 1790s, would provide grain to the rural poor in order to help them out. And it was quite complicated. It was, there was means testing, there were tables of like how much each person would get. The problem was that you had a criticism, and then many of the kind of economists of the time, so people like Daniel Ricardo, of comparative advantage fame, and Malthus as well, really, really were opposed to it, because their theories at the time said that all you're doing here is you're encouraging people who would normally die and who are unproductive, and that's why they can't feed themselves. All you're doing is you're supporting that, and you're potentially causing catastrophe. So you're creating the conditions for a Malthusian collapse. And there was the other argument that it also allowed employers to underpay their workers, because they knew that the poor law system would step in and make up the difference.
Interesting, kind of like our tipping system. That's one of those critiques as well. So
Exactly,
yeah.
right. That it's many of these questions are very, very modern in their nature, and so Chadwick oversaw first the reform of the poor law, and the creation of a centralized system, and the birth of the workhouse. So these were, rather than you being given funds in your own house, if you had to resort to, I suppose, it's not public money, but it's like parish support or vestry support, you would have to go and live in like very bad conditions, and this, yes, it decreased the number of people seeking it out. It also separated this idea of like the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. So there was no concept of like, oh, these are people who've fallen on hard times. And many local magistrates refused to do it and kept distributing in the way. So these are, this is culture war stuff, right?
Yeah, this was an incredibly cruxy or important part of your essay. It felt like this pivot from thinking about public health as this, kind of built on the concerns that Chadwick had and these other folks, and then turning into this more kind of sympathetic view, I guess, where you have this sense of that people have some people are not set up to succeed, or they live in bad conditions, but it's not because of some kind of moral failing. It's just where they happen to have been born and things like that. So it feels like there's this big pivot that's also driven by some new science. Like it seems like this is kind of the period in which we see figures like John Snow. If you want to, I know you mentioned cholera before, and people might have some sense that he's related, but if you could dive into him a little bit and explain how he fits in, and kind of this flip to viewing public health as something that's more propped up by science.
Yeah, exactly, and yeah. So Chadwick opposed more money being spent on the poor law first, and then after he'd reformed the poor law in, I think it was 32. I'd have to check that for you. He was part of the Poor Law Commission. He then turned his attention to sanitation, and as you say, his purpose and his reason for investigating sanitation was that he believed, or he argued, he demonstrated that poor living conditions resulted in a worse like life outcomes. So by living in, he would have called it bad air, but he identified that poor sanitation led to elevated rates of diseases, and and he, and he very prominently, his name is up on the facing of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, because he's one of the first people who seriously takes like statistics. So statistics, facts about the state, is a field that is just emerging at this point. And he writes up this vast report called the Report on the Sanitary Condition of the Labouring Population, in which he goes through how how they how the built environment around them is creating sickness, is causing people to take time off from work, or stopping them from or dying, right, and then having to resort to poor relief. So his emphasis here is, how can we reduce the cost of sickness on the state and on the people and the landowners? And again, but it's important to state here, it's also here because what he wants experts in. He wants to have a technocratic system, and for him, sanitation is one of these things that has been held back, that is backward, and that by updating it, he can modernize. And a lot of his efforts, so doing things like, so he was a Poor Law Commissioner, or Secretary of the Poor Law Commission, and he was spending money on doing things like paving streets, which was massively controversial at the time. And that was him, testing, doing, can he get away with doing these things, paying for things that really aren't linked to the directly alleviating sickness, but he argued would reduce it. But it was real like culture war stuff. And yeah, so you have originally this man who, and him and people like the Earl of Shaftesbury and these evangelical Christians who very, very vigorous about trying to improve people's lives and fix what they saw as like moral degradation. So the problems of the poor are linked to their own behavior, that they're not clean, they're not washing, they're drunk. And then so that was the context that he was writing his report in. And then, as you say, you get a move via people like John Snow, and then William Farr, who is a statistically trained doctor. He was the first real statistician in the General Registry Office, who start changing the narrative and start saying that actually, I beg your pardon, start saying that actually it is necessary to care for people, both because it affects their life outcomes differently, and so they are deserving, therefore, of greater support to prevent this discrepancy. So you move from a system of, this is an unfortunate case because they don't work as hard, to more of a, yes, they don't work as hard, and therefore we should involve ourselves more and more to prevent this kind of discrepancy and allow people to live a more complete and a healthier life. And I would to get to your point about John Snow. John Snow is John Snow of the Broad Street Pump fame. Is a doctor who he grows up in the north and sees cholera hit, because cholera only comes to Britain in 1831 from India, and there at the time there were panicked reports of as it spreads across Europe, and people sort of saying, there have been cases in Budapest, in Prague, in Munich, really exactly, and it lands first in Sunderland, and it's a terrifying disease because no one can quite work out how it spreads. For those who are lucky enough not to have been afflicted with cholera, it is a disease that causes the ions in the gut to flow out into your gut, which means that all the liquid, that you get an osmotic pressure that sucks liquid into your bowel. To put it in slightly less fine terms, you basically start shitting water and just just lit water out of you, coming out the back end of you, and you die of dehydration because you're unable to keep any water, store any water, so you die that way. And it's a horrible death. And there was no one knew what caused it. No one knew what it was. The best idea at the time was the idea of miasmas, which are the idea of like bad smells causing disease. And this was a very common and widely held view, and one that I think it's important to state, because I think it's very easy to fall into these ideas that, oh, people in the past were ignorant and were not like being rational or thinking about it. This idea of miasmas was supported by some evidence at the time. So William Farr, who I described and who helped Chadwick write his famous report, had demonstrated that as you went higher up, away from water level, sort of sea level, rates of cholera seemed to fall, which seems to point to, or could be interpreted as supporting the idea that cholera was spread through these smells, and that seems pretty.
It feels very intuitive. I feel like I
exactly
back miasma theory inclinations myself when I'm on my run in the morning and I go past this particular intersection that has a special sewage stench. I find myself like holding my breath and be like, no, I can't catch the miasma.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It makes total sense. Like your body rejects the smell. It's quite intuitive. And probably if you improved your built environment and reduced bad smells as a proxy, you'd probably improve health outcomes, right? Like it's not the worst heuristic to follow. The problem of course, right, is it is wrong. And what Snow was able to demonstrate was that he produced what I suppose now would be called like case maps. So he marked when there was an outbreak in Soho, he marked on a map where all the cases were, and found that they were all localized surrounding a single pump that all the families have been using to get their water, because cholera it's a waterborne disease that is spread from contact with fecal matter. And he was able to convince the Hackney health officer to remove the pump, the handle that allowed you to draw out water, and the outbreak cleared up. And this was the compelling evidence. And tragically, he died soon after this, and never got to see his theories be fully accepted.
Not of cholera, I hope.
Not. That's a good question. Not. I don't believe so. It would be tragic, right? The last his great nemesis finally got him.
Is the handleless pump still in? Is it memorialized somewhere?
Oh yeah. It is an absolutely iconic epidemiological artifact. I'm pretty sure it's at UCL, but I'd have to double check. But it's the sort of thing you hear about as one of these like real artifacts of, because it created the modern world. As I said, it created this possibility of cities no longer being vast demographic sinks. Is when you start understanding why these deaths are happening. Because up to that it was just given. It was just understood that if you move to the city, if you have 4 children, 3 of them will probably die. That's the kind of numbers that you need to just understand, and it's fact and accepted.
Yeah, no good. And this moves us a little bit forward, because I want to talk about like now we have this new public health understanding. People can kind of expect better living conditions, more flourishing, and this brings us towards wastewater actual treatment. And this was a very interesting kind of pivot into it's not enough to just slough your waste off out of the city and move it out of sight, but it's actually really beneficial if you can then treat the water and both get the water back in use and then also, actually target some of these diseases instead of just pushing them away. So I was curious what some of the first big achievements in actual sewage treatment were, and what are some of the ones that you find the most compelling?
Yeah, so there is an awful story of the 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 SS Princess Alice disaster, where because Bazalgette succeeds finally in building these sewers, what are called intercepting sewers, which are sewers that capture waste as it otherwise it once would have poured from the city into the Thames, kind of flowing inward into the Thames. And he builds these pipes, effectively, that run alongside the banks of the Thames. So he embanks the Thames, building these very famous, beautiful, and now, still standing now embankments, the Chelsea, Victoria, and Albert embankments that run along the Thames, which allows him then to pump a lot of sewage downstream and then to outflows. And previously, they would have just poured it out, right? They waited until the tide was going out, and you just released the sewage. And it's a thing that we now just take for granted that you can't do this, but they are inching their way towards our modern understanding, and for them at that point, they'd had enough difficulty trying to convince people to pay for the sewers and the pipes at the beginning, and the engines required to pump the sewage up to different elevations to keep the gradients and keep it flowing. And this pleasure steamer, sinks just by the outlets, and there's absolute outrage as there are reports of people dying not from drowning but from vomiting so much as the boat sinks into the black, greasy, disgusting waters. And this prompts the idea that maybe we need to
we can do better. This is too fetid.
Yeah. You know what actually, this is not really on. And again, part of it is because London is still expanding and London is moving eastwards as well, and so there's a big conflict in the funding of how far are you going to put it out, how far away from London are you going to do it, because this is it's a sort of problem in economics, right? The free rider problem, that you've got a whole load of people who aren't really going to see additional benefit from that, and they're paying, and other people are benefiting if you move it further and further away, and they see diminishing returns to that. But at first they begin by throwing in various salts to de-smell it or deodorize it. But then you start moving towards more systematic treatments, and the treatment plants that are originally built at the outflows to the east of London are still there. These are still major sites of London's water treatment. And you first move to this idea of, you've got various ones. So there's anaerobic digestion, which is using colonies of cells that will then consume this and eat it up, and this is basically what happens in, say, compost heaps. But you get the developments of things like trickle filters, which aim to start moving you towards this idea of sewage goes in, and that clean water that you could put back into a watercourse, and not worry about it. I mean, basically three things: smelling, having a whole lot of organic matter. So that's your things like your carbon-based materials, and then having nutrients removed, so things like nitrogen and phosphorus. And these are all important for sort of different reasons. So pathogens are an obvious one, because you don't want cholera in your water. But it's actually comparatively quite an easy one to deal with. So you can filter water with sort of existing sort of sand beds, and that was actually part of the reason that they discovered that was one of the ultimate things that revealed that cholera was water-based, was they were able to demonstrate. William Farr, after Snow's death, was able to demonstrate that the water companies were filtering their water differently, and the people who drew their water from, I think it was the Vauxhall or the Southwark one, but I'd have to check for you. They had a filter that wasn't working and was leaking, and so far more people getting water from this company were getting sick. So pathogens are easier. Your next two are a bit harder. So your organic matter. This is important because if you release organic matter into a river, bacteria will start eating it. This is food. This is like things that they can consume. But in doing so, what they're aiming to do is they're trying to oxidize the material. So they consume oxygen in order to break down these like molecules. And that if there's too much, that can consume more oxygen than is dissolved in the water, and consume it faster than oxygen can get into the water. And so that can result in fish dying, plants dying, and you just effectively killing off a watercourse. And then your nitrogen and your phosphorus is sort of similar. Algae love nitrogen and phosphorus, and if you release them, you can get eutrophication and big algal blooms that can cover a lake or a river or a sea. So it's often one of the real signifiers of pollution that you can look for is if you see a river that is covered, not in duckweed, that's slightly different, but in like algae, like green slime. That's a real sign that the water is polluted, and when these algae eat all of the nitrogen and the phosphorus, they die and they create a whole lot of organic matter that then is consumed by the microbes, and then you've got that similar problem of the death of a watercourse.
Oh, this is fascinating. So it feels like a lot of the treatment is predicated then on managing oxygen levels. Is that kind of, if it boils down to something?
Yeah, exactly. And it's not really something that you kind of think about, right? Because sewage is dirty, so the thing that you kind of want to do is you want to remove the disease. That's how I think a lot of people kind of intuitively think about it. But
yeah. Well, I guess it also depends too if you're thinking about primarily drinking water, something that's going to be flowing through pipes back into cities, or if you're thinking about where the excess actually ends up, which is presumably back out in natural environments and in riverbeds and things like that. So it's all related, but I suppose it's kind of where up or downstream in the process you're focused on.
Yeah, and I mean it's very funny some of the historical accounts you have of people kind of early 19th century, because it's important to say originally you were not allowed to put sewage into the Thames. Like from it was only at the beginning of the 19th century that you were actually allowed to put any sewage into the Thames, and before that it had been fairly clean. And it was only with the arrival of the water closet, the flushing loo, that the amount of water generated, the amount of waste water generated, became so vast that they had to legalize putting waste into the sewers, because they had sewers already, but these were for like rainwater and standing water. So but there are these accounts of people saying that the water brought up to my table contains the suppurating remnants of the 1,000 bodies of which it has already passed through. I mean, people. I think it's pretty objectionable, even if it's not lethal, having brown bits floating around in your drinking water.
Yeah, definitely not. And you said something really important here, which I thought was fascinating, is this idea about managing kind of water and the removal of stagnant water and things like this is one of the kind of early primary purposes of the sewer. I guess I think of sewers and sewage management now as primarily focused on waste removal, but even back in like ancient Rome, that you said that was if anything, a very secondary use of the sewers, and instead it's mostly about managing water flow and things of that nature.
Yeah, exactly. It's for most of human history, and actually a lot of places still around the world, feces are put in a pit. You drop them into a sort of long drop pit, and they're covered over and buried, and that is where like sewage goes. And it's actually, if it's actually very quite dry. Urine is a small component of it by weight, and can rapidly be sort of absorbed into the ground. For most of history, the reason you had sewers or ditches or drainage systems was because standing water or rainwater are really, really damaging to cities. So, there are examples in sort of Mesopotamia where a lot of these early cities are built often out of kind of mud bricks. So having water lying around can degrade, breaks down this mud, causes it to fall apart, and can be very, very damaging, particularly when you think about how a lot of these cities are built. There's nowhere where water could be absorbed. Houses are very, very closely packed together.
And this is still a huge problem. I know I think about modern LA as a big example. They always, whenever there's any kind of flash flooding there, they have no permeable surface because it's a big concrete jungle. And so it
Yeah,
remains a big challenge.
absolutely, absolutely. And what they would do is they'd have often ditches, either went down the middle of the road or on the sides of the road that could hopefully channel some of this liquid away. And there was a great line that I came across of how, because people would sweep a lot of their kind of the leavings from inside out into the street, this would get, and that potentially includes feces. This would then get compacted and build up, so the level of the street would rise up until you would have to start stepping down into people's houses, or even at some point board up your front door and build a door on the first story. That these places were buried in waste, but it was often, the waste was not really a problem. It was the water, and if anything, the waste was a useful resource. So originally, human waste was really valuable because you could carry it out to the fields and use it as a fertilizer. So there are the fields around these like ancient cities were often fertilized basically to the range at which a human could carry like a basket of feces out economically. So Jerusalem still has a dung gate out of which the feces was carried, and then you can usually get about 3 to 4 kilometers out. And beyond that, it just takes too long. It's too expensive, and it's not worth it. But this was a valuable resource. So people were not throwing it in the river or wasting it. It was a useful, valuable economic commodity. Commodity, yeah.
And actually, that's a perfect transition because I'd love to just go into. I mean, it kind of feels like we end where we've started in your essay, but so much richer and with so much more kind of modern technology and science. But once again, humanity has seemed to figure out ways to derive really vital molecules and useful compounds from our waste. And so I'd love for you to just talk about some of your favorites there. I mean, it seemed like everything from information related to human health, which we kind of briefly touched on, and then also things like energy and maybe even compounds like gold. So yeah, if you can dilate up mining, that would be great.
Yeah, so the arc the arc of history is long, but it bends towards you having to live with your own shit. So yeah, as you say, that as more humans have moved into cities and this problem of waste becomes larger and larger, what was originally an effort to shunt waste out and put it out of sight, out of mind, soon becomes one of, actually, we can't afford to do this anymore. That not worrying about your waste is a real luxury, and actually one that in a world of, I beg your pardon, in a world of scarce resources, that and kind of growing competition for resources, i.e., there the existence of this like stream of molecules is too valuable to ignore, and this is a long trend that starts happening even at the beginning of the 20th century, but really picks up speed towards the middle and then on into the 21st century. And there are sort of these fascinating anomalies in it, or anachronisms. So, for example, during the Second World War, Exeter in the southwest of England has all of its lights gas lights and street lights powered by biogas that is produced from anaerobic digestion. By digesting this shit, it produces a methane-containing gas that is burned. This idea keeps going on, right? So anaerobic digestion is just one of the examples of these techniques. Some of the other ones are, gosh, I mean, let's think. What are some of the really interesting ones? Well, okay, so anaerobic digestion. Then you've got people for whom the water is the really valuable thing. So, in countries like Malaysia or Australia or Israel, the loss of this water when you're in water scarce places is so significant that they're basically willing to trade energy for water at a far higher, more expensive exchange rate than people elsewhere in sort of water more rich places. So you get these very, very high pressure ultrafiltration systems that are basically like rolled up carpets, and you force the liquid in at one end, and because it's at such high pressure, you've got a rolled up membrane, and it's got a big surface area, and then only the water can then get through, and then go out. So you get a pure water supply. Some of the other ones, I mean, there's algae I mentioned before feed on the nitrogen and the phosphorus, and so you can grow algae, and algae have been looked at they're very good at producing oils. So people have considered them as sources of oils for everything from kind of biopetrol to plastics precursors. People have also used them to produce oxygen. So algae are basically small plants. They photosynthesize. And so NASA is actually trying to combine this energy production of anaerobic digestion for gas, pure water extraction, and oxygen as part of if you were looking at doing deep space exploration, how can you be as efficient in preserving all of these molecules as you can? I mean, there are then even weirder ones. So I think I write in the article about how people have explored mining gold and silver from sewage. So I think in a 1 million person city, there's about 13 million pounds worth of resources that could be extracted, including sort of 2.6 million of gold and silver. So these are ideas, and some of them are more developed than others. So struvite is a phosphorus compound that's used in fertilizer, and the EU is very, very active in trying to promote phosphorus reclamation for fertilizers to reduce its dependence on Russia and Morocco, who have these big phosphorus mines.
That's fascinating. And I think, isn't this one of the ideas that's kind of undergirding some of this urine reclamation as well? I think all things being equal, it would be better if we were able to separate the solid waste from urine, because urine, I think you spoke to it earlier, has a higher concentration of some of these valuable resources.
Yeah, exactly. Urine is the way that we expel our nitrogen-containing compounds. So humans produce urea, crocodile, and then basically depending on how large of an animal you are or how much access to water you have, you either produce more or less concentrated forms. So apparently crocodiles urinate basically crystals, because
Sounds painful. Sounds like passing.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
But exactly. Separating them is actually quite important, and there are places already that do this. So my brother was walking along the length of Corsica one summer, and he said that all the loos there up along the kind of ridge of this island are you basically poo on a conveyor belt, and then the urine and it's on a slope, and the urine runs down it into one collection bin, and then you have to manually rotate this conveyor belt to move the solid matter up the ramp where it drops off into a separate bin. So yeah, you're absolutely right, and people have looked at. So Bill Gates funded various sort of ideas of loos that would be less water consuming and could also do this like solid liquid separation, and potentially even burn the solids as a power source and a way of powering the whole thing to create like a genuinely,
I love this idea of a perpetuating motion machine loo.
well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, ridiculous, right? The idea that actually we've achieved a human powered robot, and it feeds on crap.
Well, the elevator is very compelling. It's definitely hard for people that are on the lower end of the Bristol stool chart, where you're working with material that's neither this nor that, so to speak. But
well, I didn't ask my brother what he would have done had he yes had he had cholera. Let's put it delicately. How his Corsican loos would have managed. But
maybe a good place to end is what is one of your favorite designs for a bathroom or a loo that you have seen?
Gosh, that's a funny question. I think I am as of yet I have not had the full like Japanese loo experience. With the whole like heated seats, like water jets to clean your bum, playing music. I was in Japan once, and they used to these loos. They'd have kind of Western loos and Japanese loos that would sit next to each other. And I remember I'd look at them. I think I was about 11. And I was absolutely terrified of the idea that actually I would accidentally press the wrong button and get like lifted off the seat by a burst of water that was so powerful that I'd be like slammed against the ceiling. So I think now having done all this work, I would be fascinated by trying a Japanese loo. But actually, critically, the thing I'd be really interested actually in is the ideas of how you can start doing some of this like separation and treatment closer to home. So I talk a bit in the article about wastewater-based epidemiology and the difficulty that disaggregating or getting resolution, temporal and spatial resolution, for signals that are coming from large neighborhoods where different rates of flow and different numbers of people can make identifying where a signal comes from very difficult. And there are various efforts to start moving this closer to homes. So we already are familiar with the idea of a septic tank, but I came across designs for systems that would effectively are trickle filters. So they sit on the roof of your house, and you break up your waste, your household wastewater, and you trickle them down panels on your roof. And using the sunlight, algae grow, both consuming the nutrients, which can then you can sell the algae on, but also then you release pretty clean water into any kind of sewage or water collection system. And I remember I read this years and years ago originally when I was first looking at algae, and I was so struck by this idea of what would it mean for us to really understand treating our own waste, that we are vast waste producers. We excrete into the world, and I think people are. I mean, there's a certain environmental idea to it that environmentalists are sort of horrified by this morally. I'm not so worried about it see it as a moral question. I see it more as like a kind of in the same way that a techie person quite likes to understand how their computer system works, and will run like Linux to be able to say that, oh, I fully get everything that my computer is doing. Like, there's a sudden fascination that I have with the idea of, oh no, I'm a self-contained unit in that I treat my own waste. Like I'm like
It's incredible. I mean, our equilibrium is just staggering. Just that we are these, as you said, this is just something we can count on every day in, day out, excreting, sweating, things like this, and people are so. Yeah, it just feels like there's a real unwillingness to kind of confront all that means, and especially the next step, which is like how could we do this more efficiently or actually derive information from it. I think people are too polite about this.
well, too polite, exactly, and I think underestimate the cost of the effort that it took to get us here. So, I think one of the great things, and I already felt like this before, so I can't fully claim, unfortunately, Xander, that writing this article has totally changed me, but it definitely reinforced this idea for me that civilization and the systems that make this all work are far more fragile and have come through a large series of like actually fairly fortuitous, I suppose, events. That it was not a given that that these systems are developed and that you get real like campaigners who are focusing on this. I mean, I'm a proud Briton, so I'm obviously delighted that this happened in Britain, and it was Britain that like forged the way here. But there was a lot of history where it was just accepted that these things were not going to be the case, and we sit at this like remarkable confluence of situations that have allowed us, if you turn on the tap and water comes out and then it drains away, and that these systems like are difficult and complicated, and if we're unwilling to like understand the cost of them and what it takes to like maintain them, I think we risk losing this like great inheritance that we have, that has been passed down to us. And I think that's probably where I disagree with like some of the more environmentalist people, right? In that actually we're far more environmental than if we were doing this more naturally, and that actually only by probably engaging more and more and trying to be more technical about understanding this can we avoid like realizing the kind of scale of the output that we produce.
Yeah, it does definitely all come back to scale. I mean, this was one of the very resonant things about that section about treatment as well, is there's some of these more kind of diffuse, gentle systems like the trickle filtration, but ultimately it takes more space. It relies on creating a high surface area so you can get the right kind of biofilms growing, and before you know it, you're doing your treatment in these really vast plants. Whereas when the activated sludge process came around, we're able to do this in a smaller footprint, smaller land area. So I think, we need continued innovation and investigation into how to make things more concentrated and efficient. And some of that does come back to breaking these systems apart and doing like more localized, resilient, as you said, near to home infrastructural projects. So it just feels like we kind of have it all now in a better way than we used to. This appreciation of these great centralizing efforts, and then also the ability to look at more kind of narrow or like solutions that are closer to home as well.
Yeah. I'm not sure how to what extent my landlord and friend Tom O would be happy with me setting up a sewage treatment plant in our living room, but I think it's a fascinating principle, and the idea that there are people online who have produced like designs for algal photobioreactors, and it is doable, and I think it is. I don't think it's inevitable. I think actually, probably, as you say, with scale, you're only going to move towards the only way that this can keep working is through doing it smaller, doing it cheaper, doing it more efficiently. That's the only way that the show stays on the road. But yes, bringing it closer as a sort of source of knowledge, right, of data, that's the real gold mine, and is for the like for epidemiology, and for potentially monitoring of population behaviors and through things like drugs or diet. You're only going to do that at a closer level, and you need a bit of both, I mean, we live in a world of extremes, right? Like you need both at both ends, and only further down the tails does the future lie.
Absolutely. Well, I hope that your roommate and friend of the show, Tom O, allows you to turn your house into a kind of temple of shit with, I'm picturing like, peat toilet in one corner. You've got the thing that you described, the system on the roof with the shit trickling down and getting algae from the sun. So hopefully one day I walk through London and I'm like, holy, what is this for us? Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Callum. Everyone should read Callum's piece. It's fantastic. It traces throughout, all of history, humanity's relationship to waste, and clearly there is no one more passionate. So thank you so much for writing for us, Calum.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
All right, thank you.